The elevator doors opened on the 43rd floor, and Juliette Marchand walked straight into the wrong life. She didn't know that yet, of course. She was too busy juggling a cardboard box of her belongings, a coffee that was already going cold, and the particular brand of panic that comes from starting a new job at 8:59 when your contract says 9 o'clock sharp. The lobby downstairs had been enormous and marble-floored, and full of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going, which had made Juliette feel, by contrast, like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a cathedral. She had been hired as a junior marketing coordinator for Pinnacle Properties, one of the biggest real estate development firms in Toronto. She had the offer letter, the parking pass, and the building keycard to prove it. What she did not have was a clear understanding of which floor the marketing department actually occupied. She had pressed 43 because the man at the security desk had said, "Marketing 40? No, wait, 43, and then his phone had rung and he'd turned away, and that had been that. So when the elevator opened onto a wide, hushed corridor with dark walnut paneling and a floor that appeared to have been recently polished to a mirror finish, Juliette assumed this was simply what a well-funded marketing department looked like. Toronto real estate money, after all. She straightened her spine, repositioned the cardboard box on her hip, and walked forward. The receptionist at the far end of the corridor looked up. She was perhaps 50, with silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and her expression did not change when Juliette approached. It was the expression of someone who had seen many things and found most of them mildly disappointing. "I'm here for orientation," Juliette said, setting the box down on the reception desk because her arms were giving out. Juliette Marchand, Junior Coordinator, Marketing. The receptionist, her nameplate read Constant, which suited her exactly, looked at the cardboard box, then at Juliette, then at the cardboard box again. "This is the executive suite," Constance said. Juliette looked around. The corridor stretched out behind reception into a series of glass-walled offices, all of them very quiet, all of them overlooking the city in a way that made the lake visible in the distance like a strip of hammered pewter. There was a meeting table in the far room, long enough to park a car on. "Marketing is on 38, Constance added. "Right," Juliette said. "Right, yes. I'll just—" She reached for the cardboard box and misjudged the angle, and the whole thing tilted, sending a ceramic mug, a small succulent in a terracotta pot, and a framed photo of her dog Biscuit sliding across the polished reception desk. The mug stopped at the edge. The succulent did not. It landed on the carpet with a quiet, definitive thud. Juliette crouched to pick it up. When she stood, a man was standing at the far end of the corridor, watching her. He was tall, the kind of tall that reads as an architectural feature in a room. Dark suit, no tie, sleeves pushed to the elbows in a way that somehow looked like a deliberate style choice rather than an oversight. He was holding a phone and looking at Juliette with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not annoyed, not amused. Something in between that had its own particular quality, like he was filing her away in some internal system and hadn't yet decided under what category. "Marketing is on 38, he said. "I know," Juliette said. "Constance told me. I'm leaving. You have dirt on your jacket." She looked down. The succulent had shed, in its brief flight, a small cascade of potting soil, which had landed in a neat line across the front of her blazer. She brushed at it. It smeared. "Great," she said, mostly to herself. Then, because she was Juliette Marchand and her mother had raised her to be polite even when she wanted to evaporate, she looked up at the man and said, "Sorry for the disruption. Have a good morning." He watched her collect her box, her mug, her tilted succulent, and her framed photo of Biscuit, and walk back toward the elevator. He said nothing. When the elevator doors closed between them, she exhaled for what felt like the first time since she'd entered the building. She found out later that the man at the end of the corridor was Nathaniel Voss, CEO of Pinnacle Properties. Worth, depending on which magazine you believed, somewhere north of $800 million. She did not find this out until her fourth day. The marketing department on 38 was a different world. Open concept, exposed ductwork, the sound of a shared Spotify playlist drifting from someone's desk. Juliette found her workstation, met her team lead, a brisk, efficient woman named Sandra who communicated primarily through color-coded spreadsheets, and began the slow process of learning which coffee machine required which passcode. She did not think about the 43rd floor again until Wednesday. On Wednesday, she took the wrong elevator, the one that opened on the left side of the lobby, which turned out to be the executive elevator, and she didn't notice until the doors opened on 43. And there was Constance again, looking at her with the patient weariness of a lighthouse keeper who has watched the same ship almost run aground twice. 38, Constance said, before Juliette could speak. I know. Juliette jabbed at the elevator button. The doors didn't close. She jabbed again. It takes a moment, Constance said. Of course it does. From the far corridor came the sound of a door opening. Juliette did not look up. She stared at the elevator button with focused intensity. The doors slid closed. When she got to her desk, she found a post-it note from Sandra reminding her that the Brennan account deck was due by Friday and asking if she'd eaten lunch. This, Juliette thought, was exactly the kind of workplace she needed. No 43rd floors, no silent men with evaluating eyes. Just color-coded spreadsheets and someone who noticed whether you'd eaten. She ate lunch. She worked on the Brennan deck. She did not take the left elevator again. The problem was that Pinnacle Properties was hosting its annual all-staff town hall on the following Thursday, which meant that for one afternoon, floors 38 through 44 were all redirected to the main atrium on the ground level, and Juliette, who had arrived late because the streetcar on King had been delayed by a filming crew shooting something in the intersection, could not find a seat anywhere near her team. She ended up squeezed into a row near the back beside a man from facilities who was eating a sandwich very quietly, and a woman from legal who had brought knitting. Nathaniel Voss presented the Q3 results. He stood at the front of the atrium in that particular way that powerful men sometimes have, as though the room had been arranged around him, rather than the other way around. He spoke without notes. He was precise, specific, and entirely without warmth. The kind of presenter who delivers good news the way a meteorologist delivers the weather. Factually, without investment in your emotional response to it. Juliette found herself paying attention despite herself. He talked about the 2 new developments in Mississauga and the East End rental project, and the quarterly numbers that had apparently exceeded projections by 14%. He talked about a community partnership with a housing nonprofit in Scarborough that the firm had been quietly funding for 18 months, which Juliette hadn't known about, and which surprised her into sitting up straighter. It wasn't a small donation either. It was a serious, sustained commitment, the kind that doesn't make the press release unless someone digs for it. She filed this information away without quite knowing why. After the town hall, there was the awkward milling about period where the catered sandwich trays came out, and everyone stood in clusters pretending to be comfortable. Juliette was refilling her coffee when someone bumped into her elbow and a significant quantity of dark roast went onto the sleeve of the man standing beside her. She turned. Nathaniel Voss looked down at his sleeve, then at her. "We've met," he said. "You have soil on your jacket," she said, and immediately regretted it. He looked at his sleeve, which did not have soil on it, and then back at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the suggestion of one, the way you can see the shape of a building in its shadow. "I owe you a dry cleaning bill," she said. "I'm sorry." Do you need? It's fine. I can get napkins." "It's fine," he said again, and his voice had that particular quality of someone who is unaccustomed to being fussed over, not rude, just unused to it. "You're in marketing, junior coordinator." "I started last week." She hesitated. "The 38th floor. I know which floor marketing is on." "Right, obviously." She looked at her coffee cup. "I'm Juliette Marchand." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Nathaniel Voss." "I know who you are," she said. "Now." "I didn't, the first time, in case that wasn't clear." This time the almost smile resolved into something slightly more definite. It was clear. His phone buzzed. He looked at it, and the expression closed again, like a door. "Enjoy the sandwiches," he said, and walked away. Juliette stood holding her coffee. The woman from legal, who had apparently materialized beside her, leaned in and said quietly, "He never talks to anyone at these things." "He talked to me," Juliette said. "I know," said the woman from legal. "That's what I mean. She didn't see him again for 2 weeks. Or rather, she saw him in the way that you see the CEO of a large company when you work 3 floors below him, distantly, in the lobby, getting into a car, or in the background of a company-wide video call, existing at the precise edge of the frame before someone else stepped into it. Her work was going well. The Brennan account had liked the deck. Sandra had sent a complimentary email, which, according to Juliette's colleague Rosie, who had been at Pinnacle for 4 years and had developed a finely calibrated sense of Sandra's emotional range, was basically the equivalent of a standing ovation. Juliette's succulent, whose name was Gerald, had recovered from its fall and was sitting on her desk looking resilient. The thing about Juliette that most people didn't know because she was careful about who she told was that she had come to Pinnacle Properties specifically. Not because it was the best offer she'd received. She'd had a better one, technically, from a firm in Vancouver, but because of the Scarborough Housing Partnership she'd read about in an industry newsletter 6 months ago. She had a particular interest in ethical real estate development. She had spent 3 years before this job working for a small, non-profit housing advocacy organization, learning every number, every loophole, every policy lever that could be pushed. She had left because the funding had dried up and the work had begun to feel like trying to bail out a boat with a teacup, but she had not left behind the reasons she'd started. She had a theory about Pinnacle, about what the Scarborough project signified. She was waiting to find out if the theory was right. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November when the elevator stopped on 43 again. Not because she'd taken the wrong one. The fire alarm had gone off during a routine drill, and the stairwells had been directed to discharge floor by floor in sequence, which meant that 38 had been held in the lobby until the executive floors cleared. And then there had been some confusion about which elevator bank was which, and by the time Juliette was back inside the building, her access card was producing an error code, and the nearest functional elevator had deposited her on the executive floor before she could redirect it. She stood in the corridor. Constance's desk was empty. Presumably Constance was still outside, since the drill had caught everyone mid-afternoon. The corridor was quiet. The long meeting table in the far room was covered in documents and open laptops, the aftermath of a meeting that had apparently been interrupted. Juliette stayed near the elevator and waited for it to come back. While she waited, she noticed something on the meeting table. Not on purpose, she wasn't snooping, but the document was large, architectural scale, and the letterhead was legible from a distance. City of Toronto, proposed zoning variance, Block 9, Regent Park redevelopment. She took one step closer, then another. She knew that letterhead, she knew that project. She had spent 8 months at the advocacy organization, trying to protect the existing tenant community in that block from exactly the kind of variance that typically preceded displacement and demolition. The developer who had been circling that project had been aggressive, well-funded, and not particularly interested in the people who already lived there. On the document, in the margin, in handwriting she didn't recognize, confirm community retention clause, non-negotiable. She stared at that for a long moment. "Can I help you?" She spun around. Nathaniel Voss was standing in the doorway of the side office, a mug in his hand, looking at her with an expression that was unreadable but not unkind. "The fire drill," she said immediately. "My card wasn't working. The elevator. I didn't touch anything. I can see that. I was just waiting. Juliette." He said her name with a precision that suggested he had looked it up at some point, or had not forgotten it from the atrium. "Sit down. I should go back to. The elevator takes 4 minutes to cycle up from the lobby right now. Everyone's coming back in. Sit down." She sat down. Not at the meeting table, which felt presumptuous, but in one of the chairs along the wall. He sat across the table from her and picked up one of the documents with the air of someone resuming an interrupted task. "You were reading the Regent Park file," he said. It wasn't an accusation. The letterhead was visible. I recognized it. From where? It wasn't a question exactly. More like an opening. She looked at him for a moment, measuring something she couldn't quite name. "I worked for a housing advocacy org for 3 years, she said. "Before this. We spent almost a year on Block 9. Trying to make sure the people who lived there had a say in what happened to them." He set the document down. "Meridian Advocacy? You know it. We consulted with them. When we were assessing the Scarborough project." He looked at her directly. "What happened to it, Meridian? Funding. Dried up. The federal grant cycle changed." She kept her voice even. "A lot of small organizations fell through the gap." He nodded, slowly. Not with sympathy exactly, with recognition. Like she'd confirmed something he had already suspected. "What's your background? Before advocacy?" "Urban planning. U of T. And before that, I grew up in Sudbury." which is relevant only in the sense that I spent a lot of my childhood watching what happens to a community when the economic base collapses and the people in charge decide it's easier to rebuild from scratch than to support what's already there. Something about this landed differently in the room. She couldn't tell what it was. He was quiet for a moment. "The Regent Park variance," she said, nodding toward the document. "The community retention clause, is that yours or the city's?" "Mine. Is it holding?" He looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because the previous developer on that block tried to use the noise remediation guidelines as a pretext to relocate 40% of the existing tenants. Temporarily, they said. Most of them never came back." She paused. "If the retention clause doesn't have enforcement language tied to specific milestone dates, it won't hold either." There was a silence, not uncomfortable. The particular kind of silence that happens when a conversation has unexpectedly become serious and both people have decided to let it be. "Where did you get your enforcement language?" he asked quietly. "We drafted it ourselves, at Meridian, with a housing lawyer in Hamilton who does this work pro bono." She hesitated. "I still have the template." Nathaniel Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen and turned the document toward her and said, "Show me where the gap is." She stayed on the 43rd floor for 2 hours. Constance returned from the fire drill, looked at Juliette sitting across from the CEO with a stack of documents between them, and silently brought them both coffee without being asked, which Juliette would later reflect was possibly the greatest act of grace she had ever witnessed. They didn't talk about anything except the project. He was direct, rigorous, and willing to be corrected, which surprised her more than anything else. She had expected resistance or impatience. What she got was attention, the precise, focused kind that is rarer and more valuable than most people realize. When she pointed out the gap in the milestone language, he didn't defend the original draft. He asked her what the fix should look like. When she explained the enforcement mechanism they'd used at Meridian, he wrote it down. When she stood to leave, it was past 6. The floor was empty except for a light still on in the corner office. "This was useful," he said, walking her to the elevator. "Not a compliment, exactly. A fact delivered as one." "I work on 38, she said, "in case you need a follow-up." The almost smile again. "I know which floor marketing is on." "Right." She stepped into the elevator. "Good night, Mr. Voss." "Nathaniel," he said. The doors closed. She stood in the elevator and looked at the number panel, and thought several things in quick succession, none of which she was prepared to do anything about yet. Sandra noticed the next morning that Juliette had come in, looking like someone who had slept well for the first time in weeks. Sandra did not say anything about this, but she moved the Brennan account renewal to the top of Juliette's priority queue, which was, for Sandra, a significant gesture. What Sandra did not know, and what Juliette had not told anyone, was that her phone had buzzed on her commute in with a message from an address she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Nathaniel Voss's assistant, asking if Juliette would be available for a meeting on Thursday to continue reviewing the Regent Park documentation. The meeting was listed in the calendar as a consultation with an external urban planning advisor. This made Juliette laugh, quietly, into her scarf, on the streetcar. She went. She brought Gerald the succulent for moral support, which she immediately recognized as a strange choice once she was in the elevator and left him at her desk instead. The Thursday meeting was more structured than Tuesday's accidental one. There were 2 people from legal and a project manager named Mitchell, who had strong opinions about milestone timelines, and expressed them at length. Juliette presented the Meridian enforcement template with the kind of calm specificity that comes from having spent years arguing housing policy in rooms where nobody wanted to hear it. The legal team had questions. She answered them. Mitchell revised his opinion about milestone timelines. Nathaniel said almost nothing during the meeting. Afterward, when the legal team had filed out and Mitchell was gathering his papers, he said to Juliette, "You should have been at this table earlier." She wasn't sure how to take that. She picked up her folder. "I was on 38. I know," he said. "That's what I mean." The thing about Nathaniel Voss, the thing that was not in any of the magazine profiles, and that Juliette was only beginning to understand, was that he was not actually cold. He was careful. There is a difference, though it takes a long time to see it, and most people don't bother waiting. He had built pinnacle properties from a single commercial property in Hamilton. that he'd bought at 26 with money borrowed from a business partner named Brett, whose name he still mentioned with a particular kind of affection that people reserve for things they nearly lost. He had made a lot of money very fast, which had brought a certain category of person into his orbit. People who were interested in the money and found the man attached to it tolerable. He had eventually understood the distinction between these people and others. This understanding had made him quieter. He trusted data. He trusted process. He was not, by nature, someone who trusted people quickly, and he was aware that this was a limitation. He had not expected, on a Tuesday in November, for a woman from the 38th floor to walk into his meeting room and quietly dismantle a legal gap that 3 senior advisors had not caught. He had also not expected to spend the following 3 weeks finding reasons to consult her again. It was Constance who said something. Constance, who had worked for Nathaniel for 11 years and had the particular authority that comes with that tenure, and who was not afraid of him in the way that most people were. "She's junior marketing," Constance said, setting his afternoon coffee down with a precision that signaled a conversation was about to happen. "If you keep consulting her outside her role, you'll need to formalize it, or HR will ask questions. I'm aware. Are you aware of the other thing?" He looked at her. "The way you talk to her," Constance said, "is not the way you talk to a consultant." He said nothing. "I'm not making a judgment," Constance said. "I'm making an observation. There's a difference." She picked up the empty coffee mug from the previous cycle. "Like you're always telling me." Juliette found out about the other problem from Rosie. Rosie stopped by her desk on a Friday afternoon in December with the expression of someone who has information they're not sure whether to share, which, for Rosie, was a notable deviation from her usual approach of sharing everything immediately. "There's a thing you should know," Rosie said. "Okay, about Voss." Juliette looked up from her laptop. "What kind of thing?" "The kind that explains why he's—" Rosie made a gesture. "The way he is, in public, at events and things." She sat on the edge of the adjacent desk. He was engaged. "About 4 years ago. Woman named Genevieve. She works in financial services, still in the city. There was a piece in the Globe about Pinnacle's expansion and she was in it, sort of presented as the partner behind the man, all that. And then 2 months after the piece ran, it was over. What happened? Nobody really knows. He didn't talk about it. She didn't talk about it. But whatever it was, he kind of—" Rosie made the gesture again. "Closed up." Which, according to people who knew him before, was a change. Juliette sat with this for a moment. "Why are you telling me?" Rosie looked at her with the patient exasperation of someone who feels they have been sufficiently clear. "Because Sandra has noticed, and Sandra only notices things professionally, which means it's gone past the point of being a thing that only I notice." "Nothing is happening," Juliette said. "I know," Rosie said. "That's what makes it the thing that it is." The Pinnacle Properties holiday party was held at a venue in the Distillery District, in a building with exposed brick and high windows, and a catering situation that Juliette's colleague from facilities described as aggressively charcuterie forward. The dress code said festive. Juliette wore a dark green dress she'd bought for her cousin's wedding in September, and hadn't had occasion to wear since, and brought Rosie as her plus one, which wasn't technically allowed, but Sandra had quietly approved it on the grounds that Rosie would otherwise spend the evening at home organizing her spice drawer. She was not expecting Nathaniel to be there. He attended, apparently, every year in the way that some CEOs do, briefly, intentionally, and then not at all. He came, he spoke to the required number of people, and he left. This was understood. What was not understood, and what Rosie clocked from across the room with the accuracy of someone who has been paying close attention for weeks, was that when Nathaniel arrived and did the circuit of necessary conversations, he eventually, with no apparent urgency, came to stand beside Juliette near the window where she was looking out at the lit courtyard below. "You're not near the charcuterie," he said. "I've been near the charcuterie," she said. "I had to leave. It was a lot. It's always a lot." He looked out the window beside her. "This is the 4th year they've used this venue. Do you like it?" He thought about this with genuine consideration, which was, she was coming to understand, how he treated most questions. "It's reliable," he said, "which is different." They stood there for a few minutes, not quite in the party and not quite out of it, looking at the courtyard lights. A group of people from accounting moved past. Someone dropped a glass near the charcuterie. Rosie, visible in the reflection of the window, was watching them with an expression of barely suppressed vindication. The Regent Park variance was approved, Nathaniel said, with the updated enforcement language. City confirmed Thursday. Juliette turned to look at him. The full retention clause? All of it. He met her eyes. You should know. It was your work. She felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized had been unsettled. 3 years of advocacy work, of feeling like the boat was always taking on more water than she could bail, and here was one clause, one mechanism, and it had held. Thank you for telling me, she said, and meant it more than she could easily explain. He looked at her for a moment. Why did you come to Pinnacle? He said. You had other options. I looked. She was not surprised that he'd looked. She was surprised that he said so, because of the Scarborough project. I read about it in an industry newsletter, I thought. She paused. I had a theory. What was the theory? That a company willing to fund something like that, quietly, without making it a PR exercise, was doing it because someone in charge actually cared. Not about the optics. She looked at him directly. I wanted to work somewhere like that. The almost smile had, somewhere over the last few minutes, become an actual one. It was not dramatic. It did not transform his face. It was small and private, and she was fairly certain she was the only person in the room who saw it. You could have just applied to the policy team, he said. I didn't know there was a policy team. There is now, he said, as of next quarter, if you're interested. She looked at him. You're offering me a job. I'm suggesting you consider an application. He straightened. There's a difference, like between cold and careful. This time the smile was less deniable. He looked at her for a moment longer and then away, back to the courtyard. Constance is going to say something unbearable when I get back, he said. She seems like someone who's earned the right, Juliette said. She'd agree with you. He turned toward the room, then stopped. The succulent on your desk, the one you brought on your first day. She was not expecting this. Gerald, he repeated, as if confirming it in some internal file. He's looking better. He's a resilient plant, she said. You'd like him. He considered this. Probably, he said, and walked back into the party. She applied for the policy team position in January. The interview panel included 2 people from legal, the project manager Mitchell, and, in a development that Juliette decided not to find alarming, Constance, who asked 3 questions and seemed satisfied with all 3 answers. She got the offer on a Wednesday. She accepted it on Thursday. She moved her desk on Friday, not to the 43rd floor, but to 39, which had recently been reconfigured to house the new policy and community relations team. Gerald moved with her. She gave him slightly more window light. The day she moved, there was an envelope on her new desk when she arrived. Inside was a key card and a brief note written by hand, in the same handwriting she had recognized on the Regent Park document. 43 has better coffee. Envy Rosie appeared in the doorway of the new office with the expression of someone watching a very satisfying film reach its final act. Say nothing, Juliette told her. I am saying nothing, Rosie said, audibly delighted. I am saying absolutely nothing. It was not a fast thing, and it was not a simple thing, because neither of them was built for fast or simple. There was the particular care that Nathaniel brought to everything, which meant that what he said, he meant, and what he didn't say yet, he was still working out. And there was Juliette's own history, the advocacy years, the funding collapse, the particular loneliness of caring a great deal about something that the world keeps deciding isn't worth funding, which had made her selective about where she put her trust. But there was also this. The Tuesdays she had walked into his meeting room and they had sat across a table and argued about enforcement language for 2 hours. And somewhere in the middle of it, she had caught him looking at her, the way people look at things they weren't expecting to find and don't know what to do with yet. She knew, because she had looked back. In March, after a long meeting about the Block 9 construction timeline, he asked her if she wanted to get coffee. Not in the building, actual coffee, across the street. At the small cafe where the espresso was good and the tables were close together and nobody from Pinnacle was likely to be there at 4:30 on a Tuesday. She said yes. They sat across from each other in a cafe that was the size of someone's dining room, with snow still visible in the gutters outside, and the city making its wet, complicated March sounds. He ordered a regular coffee with nothing in it. She ordered an oat milk latte, and he did not comment on this, which she appreciated. She told him about Sudbury. and about the advocacy years, and about the specific afternoon when she'd read the Meridian funding decision and sat in the organization's small office and understood that it was over. He listened with the focused attention she'd come to recognize. He told her about Brett, who had co-founded Pinnacle with him, and who had been his closest friend for years, and who had left the company when things got complicated with Genevieve, and how losing the friendship had been, in some ways, harder than losing the engagement. She listened to this without filling the silence afterward, which she could tell, from the way he looked up, he had needed. The snow in the gutters melted while they talked. The cafe got full and then quieter and then full again. She bought the second round of coffees because he had bought the first, and she was not someone who kept track of these things, with the intent of letting someone else stay ahead. "You are extremely difficult to surprise," she told him. "You've managed it a few times," he said. "When?" He looked at her across the small table. "The first day," he said. "When you apologized and then told me I had soil on my jacket." She laughed. "I regretted that immediately." "Don't," he said. "It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a while." She looked at him. He was not looking away. This was, she had come to understand, how he did things, directly once he had decided, not with a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration, just with the particular steady attention that was, for him, the most significant thing he could offer. "Nathaniel," she said. "Juliette," he said. Outside, the March Street was gray and cold and thoroughly Canadian, and inside, the cafe was warm, and Gerald was on her desk 3 blocks away, getting the best light of his life. And somewhere on the 43rd floor, Constance was probably already forming an opinion about how this would all turn out. She was not wrong.